Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Begane. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be covering Chapter 4 on ethical decision making. So before we begin today's lecture, what I want you to do is download the Ford Pinto case and read it. It's located on Canvas under assignments, and then hop back into this lecture. It's a pretty quick read. So I'm going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to read that. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to read the Ford Pinto case. So what we're going to talk about today is essentially what is ethics when we talk about it in the context of business, and what role does it play? How do we know when we're making ethical decisions, and how do we do it? And what's a real life example of this? So I chose the Ford Pinto case because this is a really good example, a good case study of how ethics plays out in real life, and how a failure to act ethically can have pretty severe consequences. So let's go into the case. As you saw from the reading, this was a pretty interesting situation. So Ford engineers were essentially given a time frame of, you need to have this car done in 25 months compared to the average of 43. It needs to be less than $2,000 and less than 2,000 pounds. Now, these relatively arbitrary numbers played a pretty big role in how this case played out. As you saw, a fair number of people were injured and died from the Ford Pinto. And the reasoning is that essentially you had a gas tank that was between the rear axle and the rear bumper. And if it were struck at fairly low speeds, just a little above 30 miles an hour, what would happen is that gas tank would essentially would be pushed against by the rear bumper, and a couple things would happen. There were things sticking out from the rear axle that would cause a spark if the tank hit it, and then also the hose from the tank would potentially rip out, leaking gasoline everywhere, and this caused a fire if it were hit at fairly low speeds from behind. And to top it off, what also happened in a lot of cases is that the doors became sealed shut, and so people were essentially trapped inside of this fire. So let's watch a quick video of what this fire looks like, so you can get an idea of how severe this really was. Okay, I'm going to share with you my screen here, and this is a Chevy Impala crashing into a Ford Pinto. So you see it hits, it starts on fire, and that fire would consume the Pinto. Okay, so obviously pretty bad situation. And the question is, how did this come about? How did it happen? Is it something that could happen again? And if we look at the case, we can see that Ford had a couple of different things going on here. Because of the time frame, what typically would have happened in sequence, things like planning, engineering, things like design, wouldn't all take place at once. But in this case, many of them happened together. And by the time they were done, tooling took place afterward. And before they could really figure out that there were all these defects, the design of the car was pretty much frozen. I mean, it would cost a significant amount to retool, to move the gas tank around. So they had to look at other options. So naturally, they said, well, what can we do that's not going to cost a lot of money? And they found actually an $11 part could be replaced in the Ford Pinto, and it would make it relatively safe. It wouldn't have this wouldn't occur. So they did what was legal at the time. They did a cost-benefit analysis, and they said, well, what is going to happen if we don't fix this? And they estimated that there would be 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles. They estimated, based on how much people were paid out for previous lawsuits, that they would have to pay about $200,000 per death, $67,000 per injury, and $700 per vehicle. So the total cost was $49.5 million if they did nothing. So then they said, well, what if we fix these 12.5 million cars with that have this defect? And they multiplied 12.5 million by $11, and came up with 137.5 million. Now, if you're looking at this from a purely financial standpoint, the decision on how to move forward is pretty obvious: 137.5 million versus 49.5. And unfortunately, that's exactly what they did. They said, well, it's a lot less costly to just move forward, let these deaths and burns happen, and we'll compensate people as needed. So pretty bad situation all around. And I've got to ask you a question. So, is it wrong when you heard me say $200,000 per life? What did you think about that? I mean, is it wrong to put a tag on a human life, to put a price tag on it? Well, we can't, this is something that I think we would all say, yes, it's wrong. But before we start kind of making decisions about the case, let's look firsthand into what David Goya said. So David Goya was someone who was very ambitious, very competitive. He got his MBA and he wanted to go change the world. He was protesting against the Vietnam War and generally a proponent of human rights. And so he thought the best way to change the system is to be inside it. So he took this job at Ford, and as part of his job, he was responsible for analyzing potential production failures, potential defects, and making decisions as to how to move forward, how to fix them, and what to do with that information. So essentially, you've got one guy here who is fairly responsible for these crashes. He ended up later on leaving to pursue a PhD, and now he's a professor. And so he's had time to reflect on this, and the reading assignment that I gave you is a pretty detailed explanation of sort of why he made this decision that he did. So let's take a look at his reasons. He decided to move forward with production of this vehicle and not fix the $11 part for a couple of different reasons. And one is we've got to understand the context that he was in. So he said that there was information overload, that this remains the busiest, most information-filled job I've ever held or would want to hold. Each case required a myriad of information gathering and execution stages. I distinctly remember that the information processing demands led me to confuse the facts of one problem case with another on several occasions because the telltale signs of recall candidates were so similar. So what he's saying here is that he was so overloaded with information, with work, that he wasn't able to make a rational choice. And again, you can, I'm just telling you the facts as he states them, and so certainly form your own opinion on this. And he said, the Ford Pinto was a relatively little problem from what he saw. He was having defects where there were thousands and thousands of cars having issues, and up to this point, there were relatively few cases that he knew about where there was this defect. And he also said that, in the culture of the organization, people's lives became fairly removed from the process, that it became a very dispassionate process, in part because it's hard to make decisions on what to recall and what not to based on, the value of human lives, because he said he would go, he wouldn't be able to do the job. He had to have some way to disengage from the situation and to look at it from what he thought was a rational position. So he said to do the job well, there was little room for emotion. Allowing it to surface was potentially paralyzing and prevented rational decisions about which cases to recommend for recall. So this is kind of the context we're in, is that he's very busy. He's got a lot of different cases he's working on. They seem similar in a lot of ways. The Ford Pinto at this point didn't have too many cases that he knew about. And so this wasn't really a big issue, that in their organization, there were no problems, only conditions. And so he wasn't necessarily advised or encouraged to make a big stink out of a relatively small problem as he saw it. So some other things he mentioned were there are moral versus business decisions, and that, people implicitly accept risk when they drive small cars. And in reality, the Ford Pinto was just the worst of a bad lot, that small cars in general are inherently risky. And so On moral grounds, he said, I knew I could recommend most of the vehicles on my list for recall. On moral grounds, I recognize that people implicitly accept risk in cars. So this is a time when there were a lot of layoffs happening. There was an oil crisis at the time. And if he made these recalls, Ford would suffer, and a lot of people would potentially lose their jobs. So like most situations, it's not necessarily a case of right versus wrong. But it was sort of a right versus more right situation that, should he recall this vehicle at risk of all these people losing their jobs when he didn't think it was a big deal? Or should he not recall the vehicle and not risk those layoffs? In either situation, sometimes you're put in a situation where no matter what decision you make, people are going to be hurt by it. And that's exactly where he was. And he also had, as we talked about with groupthink, when you have this desire for harmony that leads to irrational decision-making, where you're so concerned about the cohesiveness of the group that oftentimes you silence your own voice because you don't want to cause any issues. Just like we saw in the Stanford Prison Experiment. Here, he kind of said, well, there was, no one voted. We all voted against the recall. It didn't fit the pattern of recallable standards, and he didn't necessarily want to be that lone voice that kept pushing this recall. So, what happened in the summer of 1978? NHTSA issued a formal determination that the Pinto was defective. Ford reluctantly recalled their vehicles from 71 to 76. A jury awarded the burn victims $121 million in punitive damages, which was later reduced to only $6.6 million. And most cases were settled out of court. So we don't actually know what payments were made because this was fairly confidential in almost every case. And this was actually the first time a corporation was charged with reckless homicide. Ford, was able to, they won the case, and from what we can tell, they didn't pay as much as the juries initially awarded them, and so you could say that Ford walked away from this better than they should have, probably. Okay, so we know a little bit about the context. David Goya tells us that, when asked about the situation, he tells us that my central thesis is this: my own scripted knowledge influenced me to perceive recall issues in terms of the prevailing decision environment and to unconsciously overlook key features of the Pinto case, mainly because they did not fit an existing script. So what's he talking about here with scripts? Well, a script is something that's automatically enacted whenever you make a decision about something. So when he talks about scripts, he's really referring to decision heuristics. So these mental shortcuts that we make in order to get through the day. If you were to cross the road and you thought, okay, there's a light in front of me, it's turning orange, there's a car to the right of me, a car to the left, one's moving at 20 miles an hour, the other's moving at 5 miles an hour, one person has their blinker on, another person is walking across the street. By the time you consciously went through each bit of information, you probably find yourself being hit by a car because you're stuck in the road or you're stuck on the side of the road. So in order to be able to cross the road, to get through life, we use these mental shortcuts. We quickly engage in the situation that we're in. We unconsciously process the majority of information around us, and we make a decision. In fact, our brains can only consciously process 40 bits of information per second. However, we receive 11 billion bits of information per second. So we're unconsciously processing 99.99999% of the information that we receive on a daily basis. We have to do this because, as I just mentioned, we don't have time or resources to consciously process all of the information around us. And so this is essentially what David Goya is saying, is that I had these schemas, these cognitive frameworks based on prior experience used to structure and comprehend new information and situations. A schema is, for example, you see an animal and it's got 4 legs. And so you think, well, maybe this is a dog, maybe this is a cat, I don't know yet. It starts coming near you, it's got big teeth, and you say, well, maybe it's a carnivore. Comes closer and closer, and it's, looking pretty big, and you say it's got a furry tail, it's got stripes, and by the time you realize it's a tiger, it's on top of you. We don't have that time. We have to rely on these heuristics. So a schema is what we use to say, okay, this fits my pattern of what I recognize as, a dangerous animal. It's large, and it's moving quickly. It's got big teeth. I don't have to wait till it gets close to me in order to guess that it's something that I should try to avoid. So the Pinto didn't fit the schema of a case of a recallable case. In his recallable cases, they were all had generally a lot of accidents. There were very specific problems that they could point to early on. He wasn't completely aware that this was such a prevalent issue. So based on these schemas, we have scripts. So scripts are a specialized type of schema that retains knowledge of actions appropriate for specific situations and contexts. When I said with a script, essentially this automates your behavior, in that when you see something fit your schema, you made a decision about this, you enact a script. So you enact this this action appropriate for the situation. So for a script for a tiger coming at you might be, okay, I'm gonna run. A script for a recallable vehicle, like the ones he normally saw, he would say, I'm going to recall this vehicle. Ford Pinto didn't fall into that. He said essentially that he trained himself to respond to prototypical cues. These didn't fit the relevant prototypical prototype for this crisis case. He said, yes, Ford Pinto fits a prototype, but it was a prototype for normal accidents, not significant deviation from expected problems. And so what he said was that he just automatically, he habitually went to no recall because it didn't fit what he saw as the criteria for a recallable vehicle. So he said there's so much time, there's so much to do and so much information to attend to, that the only way to deal with it was by means of schematic processing, these mental shortcuts, these heuristics that we rely on. In chapter 3, when we talked about judgment errors, judgment errors are outcomes of the mental shortcuts that we use. In many cases, it's acceptable to allow some type of error in the process, but when it comes to life and death, we really want to make sure that we're not making any of those judgment errors. So the closest one to this case would be that representative error, where this, typically he had a mental model of what a recallable vehicle looked like, and this simply didn't fit that, and so he didn't expect it to be something that he should recall. So we all have some scripts and schemas that shape our ethical decision making. What do we look at when we look at a situation, or when you look at a situation, how do you quickly determine what's right or wrong in this scenario? You have your own moral and ethical grounding, and that's not really what you're here to learn today. It's not for me or anyone else to tell you what your moral beliefs should be. But it is important to understand when a moral situation arises, because as David Goya explains, he simply didn't see this as a moral decision, that this was a business decision, that they just needed to use, they just needed to do a cost benefit analysis, and that's all that needed to happen. So if I were to ask you, is this likely to happen again today, or could it happen again today? Most of us would hope that it wouldn't. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So this is an article from just a few years ago, and what happened is that GM, one of the biggest automakers, and also one that got a $50 million government bailout, found that they had a flawed ignition switch, but rejected a fix that would have cost 90 cents a piece per car. And so the switch could be jarred into accessory position, shutting off the engine, disabling power steering and brakes, and preventing airbags from deploying while the vehicle is moving. And these faulty switches were linked to 124 deaths, and they were mainly in vehicles that were targeted toward younger people who were looking for entry-level cars. So, people who are just graduating from college, things like people like that. So this did happen again. and GM is still in business, of course. They did pay out lawsuits, but it's something that happens over and over. So, in business, we need to decide early on sort of what are our ethics, what are our values, how are they going to be used to guide our decision making moving forward? Because if you wait until you're put into a situation like David is, you're probably not going to see the ethical undertones of the situation or know how to respond. So if I were to ask you, do you consider yourself to be ethical? Most of us, I think, would like to say yes, right? And ethics, when we break it down to its sort of its constituent parts. It's the principles, norms, and standards of conduct governing an individual or group's behavior. And so with these ethics, we form moral standards or moral principles. Essentially, when we're talking about morals, this is just the right or wrong. What do we believe is right or wrong? Ethics in general covers sort of how to live a good life, our rights and responsibilities every day, the language of right and wrong. How do we define what's right in our book, what's good and bad? So ethical behavior, it really derives from a lot of different areas. A lot of it comes from different religions. A lot of it comes from different philosophies, different cultures, and it changes over time, and it changes depending on the culture and the context that you're in. For example, in some places it might make sense to eat cows, and in other places that would be unethical. Same with dogs and so forth. So ethics is very much situational and context dependent. And so in terms of ethical decisions in students, we see that a lot of students have admitted to cheating. And so you might think, okay, cheating, 66% of students have cheated, not a big deal, right? Well, let's say you're going into a surgery and the anesthesiologist puts you under and the doctor whispers into your ear, I cheated through med school. How would you feel? Most of us would probably feel pretty uneasy about that. And so that kind of draws the question of where's the line? What's acceptable and what's not? Is it okay for an engineer to cheat who's going to be building bridges that you're going to be driving on, that your kids might be driving on? Is it okay for doctors to do it? In business, well, maybe the repercussions aren't so great, right? I mean, actually future MBAs, 76% reported cheating. So business, we seem to have the worst of the lot. But we're not saving lives, right? We're not building bridges. But as we saw in the Ford Pinto case, business decisions, the decisions that you make have the potential to impact a much higher degree of people, much greater number of people than even potentially a doctor or an engineer. So we kind of have to decide for ourselves, what are we going to agree is ethical and what's unethical. In order to be ethical, we have to do a couple things. First, we have to have ethical commitment. So this is a level of dedication and or desire to do what's right, even in the face of potentially harmful personal repercussions. And that's really key because we can all be ethical when it comes down to it. I mean, if the situation is right, it's easy to be ethical. But what if I were to ask you, would you steal a loaf of bread? You would probably say no. But what if you had a starving child at home? In that case, would you still do it? I think a lot of us would say, yes, I would, because I'm willing to violate my normal ethical standards in order to do something that I think is more important. And some of you might, your ethics might just be, they might not be situation specific. You might say, in any case, I'm not going to do that thing. So in terms of, actually one quote that I really liked by our baseball head coach here, he said, if everyone likes you, you're doing something wrong. If no one likes you, you're doing something wrong. And I think that's really important because if we're so worried about cohesiveness, if we're so worried about it being agreeable and being liked, it's going to be hard to always act ethically, because when someone says that thing, that, racist or discriminatory thing, or someone, makes a comment that we probably should speak up about, it's easy to let it slide when we don't want to rock the boat, when we want people to like us. It's hard to be ethical. It's hard to step up and to do what's right all the time. So one other aspect of ethical behavior is what's called ethical consciousness. We need to develop the understanding, the ability to understand the ramifications of choosing less ethical courses of action. Now, you might think, well, I know what happens if I choose less ethical courses of action. And let's look at an extreme case of this. So Ethan Couch, he had gotten drunk, drove, and ended up killing a bunch of his friends. But he was able to get out of he famously got out of jail time because he said that his affluent lifestyle had led him to be unable to understand the ramifications of his decisions, that he had grown up so wealthy and so privileged that he couldn't possibly understand the ramifications of driving drunk. And this obviously is, I think most of us would probably disagree with his argument that he should have known what he was doing. But we saw in the case, in the Ford Pinto case, even people who go into a situation with generally good intentions can still be unaware of the ramifications of their decision making if it's not as ethical as it should be. So in terms of ethical competency, really what we're talking about here is this involves a consideration of ethics in each stage of the problem solving process. So when we're trying to develop an ethical competency, we just want to look at each stage of our systematic decision process and say, okay, am I defining this problem ethically? They define the problem as a business one instead of a moral one. And so you could argue that they probably define that the wrong way. And just simply go through each stage of your decision-making process and apply your own moral and ethical framework. Because what's often legal isn't necessarily moral or ethical, and so, or it doesn't necessarily meet your standards for what's moral and ethical. What they did with the cost-benefit analysis was perfectly legal, but I think a lot of us would argue it's not ethical. So, in terms of recognizing ethical dilemmas, there's something that is really important and fundamental to know about, and that is moral intensity. And so this is what we would call the degree of badness of an act. Essentially, moral intensity is the degree to which you see an issue as an ethical one. So I might say, okay, if something is, let's say there's an issue where somebody picks up a quarter on the side of the road. Well, it wasn't their quarter, but I don't think it was really a bad thing to do. Whoever lost it probably isn't going to come back looking for it. But what if that was $200,000 in a bag, right? We might feel that they have an obligation to report that. So your degree of moral intensity is based on how bad you deem that act to be that someone's doing. So this is affected by a couple of different things. First, it's impacted by magnitude of consequences. So we determine moral intensity by the total impact or consequence that it has on someone else. And so if the impact is significant, we might deem it to be high in moral intensity. And if it's not, then, like the quarter, then we might think it's irrelevant. So social consensus is another. Society, the norms that we have tend to play a pretty big role in whether or not we see issues as ethical or not. And so how much society agrees this is a bad act determines the moral intensity of a situation. The probability of the event occurring, so the likelihood that an action will lead to expected negative consequences, is also a big issue. So we might say, okay, well, I don't think this is, I can break the speed limit here or drive drunk, and I don't know if this is really going to impact someone else. So the moral intensity could be low on that for someone, when in reality, the probability of that event occurring, even if you don't think it's high, if it happens once, well, someone could get really hurt from it, and that could be a pretty bad situation. Nonetheless, we use that to determine our degree of moral intensity. Temporal immediacy, the length of time between the behavior and the consequences of that behavior. So for example, let's say I am throwing a plastic cup on the side of the road. Well, one plastic cup, I mean, probably not going to impact the environment too much, but if everyone does it over a long enough time period, then we're going to hurt the environment. And so that temporal immediacy, if we do something and we don't see the negative impact right away, we're less likely to see that as high in moral intensity. Proximity or feelings of nearness toward the moral agent. This has, if we feel near to the person being impacted, to the victims or the beneficiaries, that can modulate our perspective of how intense the situation is. So let's watch a quick video on on what proximity means in real life. Well, in a TV show. Just a moment, and we will pull it up. Okay.
Maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do? I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Take a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
Okay, so, what did we learn? Chitty? Talk it out, buddy. What are we thinking?
He thinks he just killed a bunch of people with a trolley.
It's just a simulation. I would never make you kill real people.
Oh, well, that's reassuring, because some of the parts of the fake people flew into my mouth!
Michael, can we just go back to the classroom?
We never left. Here, I'll show you.
Look, see, buddy? None of this was real.
Well, they're fake people, but their pain is real. Does that make sense? There have to be stakes, or it's just another thought experiment.
This is awful.
You specifically asked me if there was a way I could connect with the material more. I'm trying, you guys.
Sorry. You're right. I want to help you understand this.
Thank you, Chief. So, let's try again.
Oh, I thought maybe we would have a discussion.
No, the whole point is to play out the scenario in real time.
Quick, Judy, what's your decision?
Okay, I can do this. I am choosing to switch tracks, so that way I only kill 1 person.
Oh, forgot to tell you, this is the scenario where you actually know one of the people. It's your friend Henry there.
JD! How are you, mate?
Eric, move!
Oh, nice trolley.
Out of the way!
I can't, JD. My boots are stuck in the tracks.
Eric, move!
Anyway, I'm going nowhere.
Again, just a simulation, an almost impossibly lifelike simulation.
Would someone's foot really fly off their body like that? That was kind of cool. Ethically speaking.
Donnie's confusing.
Maybe there's a more...
Okay, so in terms of the takeaway from that is not only is that a really funny show, but proximity plays a role. And so if you had the decision to, let's say, move that trolley that's heading toward 5 people to head toward 1 person, would you do it? Well, it really depends on your moral philosophy. If you think that you need to do what's best for the greater good, then you would flip it over to kill the 1 person rather than all 5. But then if I were to ask you, what if it's a family member or a friend? That's certainly going to impact your decision making, because now you have proximity or nearness toward that person. And while we're on the topic, a really interesting finding from this is that the majority of people say that, well, actually, I should say 90% of people would flip the switch so that only 1 person was killed. However, let's say that same track was hurtling down the track toward, the same train was hurtling down the track toward 5 people. And now you're on a bridge above it, and there's a heavy person in front of you. You can push that heavy person in front of the train, and that heavy person gets killed, but they stop the train. Would you do it? Well, about 30% of people say they would. Now, in both situations, you're changing the situation so that one person gets killed rather than 5. However, in the second situation where you physically have to touch the person, push them into the train, rather than simply flip a switch, well, now you're closer to that individual. You have more proximity toward them. And so the moral intensity for you would likely increase, even though the outcome is still the same. So proximity plays a pretty big role here. And then concentration of effect. So this is the extent to which consequences are focused. So an example of this might be, I might feel much less, I might feel less bad about, say, denying 100 people coverage that would lose them. Let's say they filed an insurance claim for $100 each. I might feel less guilty about saying no to those 100 people and they each lose 100 than, say, one person who would lose 10,000. So it just, depends on how concentrated that effect is that the outcome is that's going to occur. So moral intensity it plays a pretty big role here. But that's not the only thing to really understand, because now we've got an idea of the degree of badness of an act. We know sort of how people go about choosing whether an act is bad or not and how bad it is. But why did good people do bad things? It still doesn't really answer that question. Why did David Goya fail to recall the Ford Pinto? Why do people torture people in wartime? I mean, why does this stuff occur? So in order to answer that, we need to look at moral disengagement, which is the process of convincing yourself that your ethical standards don't apply in a particular situation. Whenever good people tend to do bad things, what they do is they morally disengage with a situation. They say, well, this isn't an ethical situation, or my ethical standards don't apply in this context. And so we often inhibit our own ability to make ethical decisions when we morally disengage from situations. And so let's take a look at different aspects, different mechanisms of moral disengagement, how it works. First, we have moral justification. So moral justification could be something like, torture is necessary in order to obtain information that can ultimately protect people we care about. So here, individuals don't engage in ethical conduct unless they justify to themselves the rightness of their actions. Don't engage in unethical conduct. And so again, moral justification, simple way of looking at it is that I'm right, we have to do this because it's for the greater good. So another is euphemistic labeling. Unethical conduct that's masked as ethical conduct by describing it in a way that changes its appearance. So instead of saying we murdered a bunch of people, we had clean surgical strikes. Instead of saying we terminated a bunch of people, we had reduction in force. And instead of saying, lying, we could say we had an alternative fact. All of these are just different ways of labeling something, so that doesn't seem unethical. And so another is advantageous comparisons. So here we might say, it's not like I stole something big. I'm comparing my actions to something potentially much worse. And so, yeah, I did this unethical thing, but, in the big picture, compared to other things, it wasn't as bad as maybe other people have done or that I could have done. Another is displacement of responsibility. So here, unethical conduct is the result of social pressure or was demanded by someone with authority. So, here we might say I was just following orders. And Stanley Milgram's experiments on obedience, he was able to get people to electrocute other people to death by giving them orders. And people followed through with this because they said, well, it's not my responsibility. I'm being told in this experiment by by this person of authority, and so I must do this. And in reality, he wasn't actually, the other people weren't being electrocuted to death, but the people who were doing it thought that they were. So in terms of diffusion of responsibility, and this often gets confused with this last one, displacement of responsibility. Here, I'm saying that someone with authority told me to do it, or there was some social pressure that resulted in me doing something I wouldn't have otherwise done. With diffusion of responsibility, I'm saying that everyone else was doing it, and so that's why I did it. So, you know, maybe everybody was stealing or everybody was cheating, and so what I did wasn't too bad because it's something that everybody was doing. Another is disregarding or distorting the consequences. So unethical conduct did not have any or only had minor negative consequences. You see this all the time with companies who are using chemicals that ultimately are harmful to people or cause cancer. They might say, oh, that didn't, you know, only a few people got that, or it didn't really, that didn't really happen that much, you know, because I didn't see any studies on it. So this is something that unfortunately happens quite a bit. We distort the consequences to make the situation seem more favorable to ourselves. Another is dehumanization. So this is something that happens an awful lot, and this is a psychological process of redefining the targets of prejudice and violence by making them seem less human than other people. We see this a lot with people talking about immigrants, for instance. So dehumanization, people might call someone an illegal who is an asylum seeker, who has legal rights to be here, or, you know, they might call someone, you know, different terms that have a negative connotation to make them seem less equal to themselves. And this is something in the Holocaust, for example. One way that prisoners were dehumanized was by giving them a number instead of a name. So now they're not even human enough to be deserving of a name. They're just have a number tattooed onto them. And whenever there's war crimes and things like that, we typically see people saying, well, these weren't humans. They were less than human. A pretty awful thing that again happens a lot. Okay, and then attribution of blame. So here, the unethical conduct was provoked by the victim. That, you know, when you see people blaming sexual assault on women because of the way they're dressed, or I suppose it doesn't have to be just women, but this is an example of attribution of blame, that this wasn't unethical because this person asked for it in some way. And of course, you know, that's a pretty horrible excuse. But again, it happens. So these are the ways that people can morally disengage from a situation. And remember, moral disengagement is simply a matter of saying my ethics don't apply to this situation, so I can do, you know, essentially whatever I want to do. If you've seen the show Westworld, in this show, they go into this world where there's essentially these like artificial intelligence, this AI system with all these robots that look just like people, and people murder them, and they do all sorts of terrible things to these robots because they say, you know, these my ethics don't apply in this fake world, right? So kind of an interesting show and example, but okay. So what I want you to do now is we're going to take a little bit of a break from this ethical behavior stuff, and I'm going to teach you a little trick. This is just you're not going to have to use this unless you want to, but we know that, you know, at this point people make errors in decision making and judgments due to heuristics or mental shortcuts that we rely on so often. We know we encounter a massive amount of information that we can't consciously process. And so we do the best with what we have. And so one thing to kind of consider here is that in order to, or with this new understanding that our decision making, that our information processing isn't perfect, well, how does that play out in a real situation? And we can apply that to names. So if you're like me, you've been introduced to someone, you've forgotten their name as soon as they've mentioned it, and that's pretty problematic. So again, this is just sort of a fun little experiment. But if you want to avoid one of the pitfalls of our limited cognitive resources, our limited ability to consciously process information, which results in forgetting names, you can do this. So author Benjamin Levy, who's trained thousands of executives to improve their memory, has said there's nothing as pleasant as someone hearing their own name. So if you want to remember every name every time, you can first focus, next ask, next comment, and next employ. And if this isn't going to be on the exam, so if you want to skip by this section, please feel free. So first, focus. If you're meeting someone, you can look into the person's face, lean forward, literally lean forward, and tilt your head to one side as they're telling you your name. So one thing that this does for us is we know that our mind wanders about half the day. We've got all this other stuff that we're trying to process. And so by leaning into this person, you're essentially signaling to yourself, okay, this is something important, I should listen to this. And you're also signaling to the other person what they're saying is important and valued. Next is ask. So you can inquire about that person's name. You know, did you say the name correctly? Is it Rob? Is it Robert? Where is their name from? If it's something unique, so that you're just asking or clarifying that you've heard the name correctly. Number 3 is comment. So say something about the name and cross-reference it in your head. What this is doing is it's helping embedding that memory of their name into your brain. So you might say, you know, someone is named Benjamin, and you might ask if they like to be called Ben, like Ben Affleck. And this isn't something you have to say out loud. You can sort of think to, if you meet somebody named Julie, maybe you had a roommate named Julie, and so you're meeting them, you say, hi, Julie. In the back of your mind, you're saying Julie, like my roommate, Julie. Whatever you can comment either explicitly or say to yourself in order to help you remember that. And next is employ. So put the name to use right away. So you're going to say, great to meet you, and then their name or something similar to that, but you just want to reiterate their name as much as you can. And one thing that can be useful here is introducing this person to someone else. So you have another friend who's around you, you might say, hey, let me introduce you to so-and-so. So this is a relatively kind of off-topic, simple thing, but it's a fun trick that I thought might be useful for you in order to remember people's names. So remember, focus, you're going to lean in, listen to what they're saying, ask questions about their name, particularly if it's unique. Comment is making a comment or cross-referencing their name in your head, or explicitly, if you're comparing them to an actor or something like that. And employ, put their name to use right away, repeat their name. And doing that will help you to remember their name in the future. So if you skipped the last section, then this is a good place to come back. And we are going to go into the 6 steps of making an ethical decision. So these 6 steps involved, just like the paddle framework, this is a systematic framework in order to make ethical decisions. And so the first step we're going to do is gather the facts. So before we can apply our ethical framework, we need to get as much information about whatever situation or problem it is that we're facing. Who's involved? How did the situation occur? Who's going to be impacted? Many of you have probably heard of Martin Shkreli. He was known for buying drugs that were necessary for people to survive and raising the price to, for example, he raised the price of one drug from $13.50 to $7.50 per tablet overnight. and I'll just read you the little excerpt here. So specialists in infectious disease are protesting against a gigantic overnight increase in the price of a 62-year-old drug that is a standard of care for treating a life-threatening parasitic infection. The drug, called Daraprim, was acquired in August by Turing Pharmaceuticals. That's Martin Shkreli's company. Turing immediately raised the price to $750 a tablet from $13.50, bringing the annual cost of treatment for some patients to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So imagine you wake up tomorrow, you get this drug that you need to take to survive, and someone just raised it to hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think most of us would be pretty upset about this situation. So what did Martin Shkreli say? He said, "This isn't the greedy drug company trying to gouge patients. It is us trying to stay in business." He said that many patients use the drug for far less than a year and that the price was now more in line with those of other drugs for rare diseases. And he's done this over and over again. And most of these drugs, again, are necessary for life. So let's kind of use this as the case that we're going to walk through. So we can say, all right, this is a drug that was necessary to survive. Martin Shkreli's company bought it with the intention of raising it to a price that most people couldn't afford. And it was going to put a lot of people at risk of losing, potentially losing their life. And so the consequences here are pretty high. The ethical issues, I think that we can state them as pretty clear, being that they're raising the price of a drug that's no longer affordable. And we need to determine, how do we view the situation? So we can view it from a purely utilitarian standpoint, which is whatever is best for the greatest good is how we should move forward. And universalism is acceptable for everyone in every situation to do this. So I think that from Martin Shkreli's standpoint, he would probably argue that from a utilitarian perspective, that this was certainly in the greatest good for his situation. And I think from a universalistic perspective, he would probably argue that, yes, it's acceptable for everyone to do this in every situation. So there are two articles here to the right. I'm going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to check those out, and then we'll come back to the recording. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to check those out. And if not, I think the video is worth watching. And if you've already seen it, worth watching again. So let's just take a look at the video from one of the articles.
You can go down in history as the poster boy for greedy drug company executives, or you can change the system. Yeah, you. Are you listening? Yes. Thank you. I truly believe you could become a force of tremendous good. Of course, you can ignore this if you like, but all I ask is that you reflect on it. No, I don't ask, Mr. Shkreli, I beg that you reflect on it. There's so many people that could use your help. May God bless you. Thank you.
Okay, so later on in the video, Martin Shkreli was laughing at the congressman, and the situation did not improve. But the good news is, as you saw, Martin Shkreli got put in jail for 7 years. He recently said that he should be let out for his knowledge about COVID testing, and they denied that request. So let's go back to our slides here. And we know that first, in order to make an ethical decision, we need to gather the facts. We've gathered the facts. There are drugs that people need to survive. Martin Shkreli's company increased the price to an arguably unreasonable amount. And in terms of the ethical issues, we've got to decide, is this right or wrong? So you can come up with your own, view of that. And then we have to identify the affected parties, consequences, and obligations. So who's being impacted here? How are they being impacted? What are the consequences of your decisions? Put yourself in Martin Shkreli's shoes and think about, how could he move forward in a different way, or what could he have done differently? In one of the articles here, you got someone who said that earlier this fall, I got a call from a specialty pharmacy in Michigan. My insurance would no longer cover the cost of Daraprim, a vital medicine in my Lyme disease treatment. They said the drugs would cost me $30,000. $30,000 a year, I asked, flabbergasted. No, $30,000 a month. And so this is a pretty severe impact, I think you could argue. And just as a little fun fact, Martin Shkreli, he is also the person who paid $2 million for an unreleased Wu-Tang Clan album and would not release it. So he listened to it bought it just to listen to himself. Another piece of good news is that Daraprim, the FDA did release a generic version of the pill. So that particular drug is no longer a big issue. Okay, so we've gathered the facts. We've tried to define the ethical issues. We've identified how people are being affected, who's being affected, and now we need to consider our integrity. So what are your values? What common rationalizations do we need to avoid? If we go back to that Ford Pinto or the GM case, we can see that there are moral and business decisions, and these aren't mutually exclusive, that we need to decide what's the right way to move forward. And as we were gathering the facts and defining the ethical issues and identifying who's impacted, one thing that I left out is that, there's a cost to come up with new drugs, right? And oftentimes you fail when you're coming up with new drugs. So you need to displace those costs into the ones that are successful. So although it may only cost a small amount to create a certain drug, there's a lot of R&D that goes into that development over time and to subsidize those ones that fail. So we also want to think, how are we moving forward here? Should all drugs be free for everyone? Should healthcare be free in general? Well, how are you going to pay for the development of those drugs? How are you going to incentivize people to create drugs that work? So in terms of our values, when we're considering our integrity, I think we could all say, yeah, everyone should have free access to healthcare. Nobody should have to be able to not be able to afford a drug they need to survive. But on the other hand, how do we incentivize people to develop those drugs and to work in hospitals and so forth? So we need to think creatively about our actions moving forward. So what's a way to resolve this issue that, drugs are oftentimes too expensive. You got people who are taking advantage of the situation by buying life-critical drugs and raising the price thousands of percentage points. So we need to step out of our situation and see possible ethical problems present. And that is, if we're using our moral imagination in this context, we might say, yes, although everyone should have free access to healthcare, there is a cost that goes into that. And so we need to be creative in that it wouldn't be necessarily ethical to give everyone healthcare and drugs for free when you've got companies who've spent a lot of money producing those things. So we need to make a decision that is ultimately going to be sustainable and be ethical. So what are the possibilities and alternatives that we can come up with? And I think if any of us had the perfect solution to this problem, then it would probably not be such a problem any longer. But if you just look up online, what are some ways that you can fix high drug prices? You'll see things like allow government to negotiate drug prices, reduce patent exclusivity loopholes, tie drug prices to drug effectiveness, stop the rebate and copay card games. None of these are perfect fixes. They're ideas I think that maybe you can get a start from. But for now, we're in an imperfect world with imperfect healthcare, and this stuff happens. So Next is check your instincts. Whenever you're making an ethical decision, it can be really useful to do a couple things. One is the Wall Street Journal test. Would you be embarrassed if your decision was on the front of the Wall Street Journal tomorrow? Martin Shkreli, hopefully he's embarrassed. His story was in the Wall Street Journal, and it was about getting sentenced 7 years in prison. And this was surprisingly unrelated to actually what he was doing with the drug prices. It had more to do with running a Ponzi scheme. Another is a platinum rule, treating other people as they would like to be treated. Personal gain. Do I have some personal gain that I'm getting from this situation that would bias my decision in order to do something ethical? I think you see CEOs a lot of times who may get bonuses for example, one company I worked for, we had a CEO who laid off 15% of the workforce. Part of that workforce was laid off because he wanted to give himself $1 million bonus right around Christmas time. So obviously that personal gain impacted the number of people, the decision that he made to lay people off. And then cost benefit testing. What are the costs and benefits of the situation? We don't need to necessarily, like Ford did, make the decision that is least costly financially, but we can look at the entirety of the situation. How is this going to cost our stakeholders? How is this going to impact our stakeholders and all the people who are interested in what's happening here? Okay, so there's a video here you can come back and watch whenever you'd like. But I want to leave with talking about fairness in the workplace. So, we've talked about ethics, how bad we determine an act to be, how that's formulated. We've talked about how we morally disengage in situations, how good people do bad things. We've come up with a systematic framework in order to walk through when we're trying to make ethical decisions. And now what I want to talk about is some aspects in order to improve ethical decision-making and fairness in the workplace. So first, we've got three major factors relating to fairness. So economics, equality, and organizational justice. Economics is essentially what's the most rational, economically based decision that we can make, and is that ethical or not? And so, for example, when there was a hurricane in Florida, you had $3,200 flights out of Miami, $99 cases of water. You saw people during the pandemic were selling hand sanitizer for $50 to $100 each. So economics, supply and demand, typically prices should increase as demand increases and supply decreases. But when ethics come into play, clearly that's not always the best route. Equality is also a big issue here. So equality indicates that everyone is at the same level and receives identical apportionment regardless of need. But certainly some people are more impacted than others. So for example, again, with the pandemic, people were paid a certain amount of money based on their income. It wouldn't necessarily have been fair to give someone who's making $300,000 a year the same amount as somebody who's getting paid $15,000 a year or who's out of work. And so in that way, equality was at least considered to a degree, in that the equity of the act was prioritized over equality. So even though you might say that everybody should be treated the same, in reality, that everyone shouldn't get the same apportionment regardless of need, because we could see that, that could be taken advantage of, or that those people making $300,000 a year wouldn't necessarily need that. And then lastly, and most importantly, is organizational justice, distributed, procedural, and interactional. This is something you're going to see throughout your college career, and it's something that I really want you to pay attention to. So when we're talking about organizational justice, here we're talking about how do people perceive your decisions as ethical and fair? And so if you want people to perceive your decision-making as ethical and as fair, you want to first make sure that you're procedurally fair. So there's procedural justice, and that the process used in the decision-making seems to be fair. So for example, if I'm making a decision about whether to promote someone or to give someone a bonus, let's say, I might say, okay, this is the process that I use, that if you hit these sales numbers, you get this bonus. And so that's transparent. It's something that everyone can understand. But let's say I am making a decision about who to promote, and I want to promote my best friend. And so I don't tell you the decisions, the process that I used to make this decision. So I'm not transparent about it. And ultimately, that inconsistency in treatment leads to low procedural fairness. So procedural fairness just has to do is the process that I use to make the decision, does that appear to be fair? With interactional justice, this is all about dignity and respect. Does the person feel that they were treated with dignity and respect or not? If they do, they'll feel that they have high interactional justice or fairness. I'm using these terms interchangeably, fairness and justice. So one example here is that I was talking to a private investigator who investigated medical lawsuits. And he said, you know, the people who sue after a botched treatment, a botched surgery, they all have one thing in common. So they all feel that they weren't treated with the respect that they deserve. And I think that when we look at employees, we can find the same thing. The people who sue often, or the people who are really unhappy with situations, it's because they weren't treated with the appreciation and respect that they deserve. So the last one, which is distributive fairness, this has to do with the perceived outcomes. Did you distribute the rewards in a fair way? So we know how you went about choosing a decision, who gets promoted, who gets raised, or so forth. We know, because that process hopefully has been transparent, we know you've treated people well, but then when it actually comes to distributing rewards, was that fair? Did you distribute them based on your process or not? And to be honest, if someone doesn't get the outcome they like, this is likely to be low. The good thing is, of these three aspects of fairness, interactional fairness is by far the most important. So when we say, does someone perceive a decision to be ethical or fair, they tend to first rate interactional fairness as most important, then procedural, and then distributive. So if you regardless of the decision you have to make, whether you're promoting, giving someone a bonus, firing them, whatever it is, if you treat people well, you're much more likely to get a favorable response from that person. They're much more likely to perceive it as fair if they're treated with dignity and respect. So that's probably one of your biggest takeaways from today, is that when you're making decisions, whatever they might be, you want to consider procedural, interactional, and distributive justice. And at the end of the day, the most important aspect of decision-making when it comes to organizational justice is interactional justice or fairness. Did you treat people with dignity and respect? If you do, you're much more likely to get a favorable response. Okay, that was an awful lot to cover. So I want to thank you so much for being here, and please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Thanks, bye.